coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. Once again, today's conversation will be about one of the many facets of motherhood. This time, we'll be taking a look at the judgment mothers face from other mothers, other people, and sometimes even themselves. In One's Got Class and the Other One Dies, we have one of the most obvious instances of mom shaming when the gang of Karens approaches Lorelai after her career day talk goes off the rails. And in the episode after that, Luke is uncomfortable with women breastfeeding in the diner and goes off on a diatribe about it to Lorelai and Rory. So we wanted to see what attitudes the writers seem to take to the ways in which judgment is passed on mothers in our society, but also how we as the audience might be sanctimonious towards the characters with the safety of fiction as a buffer.
As per usual, this is your spoiler alert. We'll be talking about anything and everything from the show, so consider yourself warned. And if you could do the YouTube-y things before we get started, like, share, subscribe, etc., we would be forever grateful because it really does help. All right, let's get into the synopses. Season 3, Episode 3 is Application Anxiety. Rory spirals out about her Harvard application after an admissions panel at Chilton, and Lorelai echoes her anxiety after a discussion with Emily about how hard it is to get in. Lorelai and Headmaster Charleston set up a lunch with Harvard alum Darren Springsteen, no relation to Bruce, sadly, which is a big help and very reassuring to Rory, especially after good feedback from Darren. Taylor propositions Luke about buying the shop he owns next to the diner to turn it into an old-fashioned soda shop, and Luke finally relents after he sees that the town actually wants it at the town meeting. Lane puts an ad in the paper seeking a band to play in and meets Dave Rogalski. And Dean questions Rory about what's going to happen after she goes off to school and bluntly asks if they'll break up.
This is followed up by One's Got Class and the Other One Dies. And Lorelai is approached to give a talk about her career at Stars Hollow High, and she suckers Luke into doing it with her. But when the students are more interested in her teen pregnancy than her job, the other parents corner her for promoting it. Yikes. Meanwhile, at the Kim house, Lane decides to assert her independence and identity in order to join Dave's band by dyeing her hair purple, but freaks out when she realizes it will kill her mom, so Rory helps her dye it back.
I'm even wearing my Mrs. Kim Disapproves t-shirt.
Very fitting for this.
Very fitting. And I have my Lorelai I Smell Snow mug, despite the fact that it's June. I was in a mom vibe today.
I can't imagine why.
Gee, I wonder.
Yeah.
So
start?
Let's maybe start off by defining shame. Just, because it's one of those things where we kind of use the word colloquially, but just to sort of put a frame around the discussion, Brené Brown, who's a fairly well-known author and podcast host and researcher at the University of Houston, defines it as an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and something we've done or failed to do makes us unworthy. And so to extrapolate that to mom shaming, it's basically when people criticize a mother for making parenting choices that differ from the choices they have made or would make for themselves. And it therefore creates that painful feeling of believing that you're flawed, you're not perfect, you're not doing a good enough job, you failed, you are unworthy as a parent. And, that creates a lot of depression and anxiety in parents. And it causes this whole spiral of judgment and events. And it's not good. It's not good. And that's why we want to talk about it, because it's kind of a big thing now. And I think it takes on a different shape here in 2023 when, we have Instagram and mommy vlogs and, professionalized motherhood. A lot of people out there writing books and memoirs and just so many depictions of motherhood in real life, not just on television anymore. And it made me think about the show and the time frame that it came out of and what the attitude toward moms was back then versus what it is now. And I thought it might be sort of an interesting discussion to sort of look at it through this more modern lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And there are instances of it on the show. Do you want to get to show mom shaming first, or do you want to continue on with just talking about a generalization of what it is and how we see modern day media play into it?
Why don't we start with the show? I think, that's we're here as we're a show podcast. Let's start with the show, and maybe we can work in the real life stuff sort of in tandem as we go along, because otherwise I'm probably just going to go on some rants, and nobody needs to hear that right now. So,
Well,
can
not
you
right now, but not right now. But I will say, mom shaming rants are warranted, and we'll get to why later.
That's fair. That's very fair. Okay, so can you think of any instances on the show of in-universe mom shaming?
I absolutely can. Quite a few. But I will start with the mom shaming of Suki when she wants to have a home birth.
Good one.
I have quite a few thoughts on this because I feel like I want to defend her, and I can and I will, but I also can understand not necessarily the shaming of it, but I can understand modern day criticism of it when science has provided so many alternatives and better reasoning for wanting to be in an environment when the safety of the child can, I guess, be perhaps factored in better, and the safety of the mother too, in terms of, again, what modern medicine can provide to make it an easier and healthier and perhaps even a life or a non-life threatening experience for the mother. So I'll say that I think it is any mother's right still in this day and age to choose how they want to bring a child into this world in terms of their birth plan. But again, I will counter my own argument and say that, we are not living in centuries past where it needed to be a reality because medicine didn't exist that could offer an alternative. And now that it does, and the science and the medicine is there to support women going through childbirth and to support the health of a newborn infant entering into this world, shouldn't we at least give that infant the best chance and the best opportunity to even live through birth? Which, I mean, again, even when you're in a hospital, things can happen. But a home birth is so risky for potentially the health of the child, and the child not making it and the mother not making it. So I think there's arguments that can be made for both sides of it. But where do you stand on it? And what do you think?
That's a really good question. I've heard that home births are just as safe, statistically speaking, as hospital births. I don't necessarily see any problem with them, especially if they're supervised medically by a highly trained midwife, someone who is, familiar with the process and who knows when to seek further medical intervention. Would I do it myself? Probably not. I just never saw it for myself. But again, that just goes to the point of one decision not being right for every single person. There are good reasons, I think, sometimes to deeply distrust the medical system. I think especially in your country. I live in the land of socialized medicine. Whereas, you guys down in the US, you have some issues in terms of, how much a hospital visit might actually cost you when it comes to giving birth in a hospital if you're not well insured. So, I never really needed to consider it for that reason. And, just beyond that, again, there's some sort of distrust of doctors and the medical establishment. And, not all of those fears are unfounded or irrational. Some of them are, but not all of them are. It's not a reason to avoid medical intervention. That's for sure, especially when it comes to something as serious as pregnancy, because, just the safety and health of mother and child are always the most important thing. But again, Suki's birth in particular was supervised by Bruce, who has done plenty of these things and seems to be really good at what she does. So I don't begrudge Suki for wanting to be in the comfort of her own home and to do it the way she did it. But on the same topic, I was also recently rewatching Knit People Knit when TJ comes in to the diner and comes to Luke and says, any minute now, Liz is about to have a baby in our living room. And Luke is aghast that she would be doing it at home. And then TJ says that she got the idea from like someone who plays a midwife at the Renaissance festivals, not from like actual medical professionals, but from another mom who has 5 kids, all of whom were born in a hospital, coming to another mom saying, you should do it at home. It's so much more natural. You should get a doula. And then Luke calls it crazy. So, Liz isn't there to hear it, but there's just this sort of attitude and idea that doing it at home is just nuts. Like, why would anyone ever do that? But plenty of people do it, and plenty of people do it safely. It's just interesting to me how the show depicts it, because in both instances of Suki and Liz, it's sort of played for laughs. It's played as being a little ridiculous. And, I'm sure there are plenty of fans of the show who have gone through home births and are like, ouch, like, why is it so crazy to do it this way? Plenty of people have done it. So I don't know. I find it interesting that like 2 dudes are sitting around in the diner passing judgment on Liz's decisions, just.
Should that surprise us though?
No, it absolutely should not. So it's unfortunate that, first we have someone butting in to give unsolicited advice who hasn't even done this herself. The idea that it's more natural, and I'm like, everyone needs to go look up naturalistic fallacy just right now. Natural isn't always better. And so, hospital staff are highly trained to handle any situation that might come up. And just because people used to have babies at home 500 years ago doesn't mean that's the best thing to be doing now. So let's get the whole, like, it's the most natural thing ever just out of our brains, because it's a fallacy for a reason. And just, people kind of talking about them behind their backs, and the whole Bruce and Lorelai thing, when Bruce walks into the room and is like, there's anti-midwife energy here. Like,
he's not here before.
It's a comedic play on it, despite the fact that Lorelai is outwardly very supportive of Suki and is not questioning or telling her not to do this. Even Bruce can kind of pick up on the fact that like Lorelai is disdainful of this idea. So it's a little shamey.
It is, because one of the very next scenes is her talking with Rory at the town hall meeting, and even Rory is just like, wait, a home birth? Really? Like, on a towel in the bathroom? Like, what are they possibly thinking? And it's, I think, even more noteworthy because it's like, this is Suki's best friend, and Rory is a very instrumental part of her life as well. So these are 2 women that Suki is immensely close to, and even they are questioning her and just being like, wait, really? Like, that's how you're going to do it? Again, it's well within Suki's right to make that choice for herself. I'm, again, like, I have thoughts that could go either way on why I think it's good, why I think it's bad, but at the end of the day, it is her call to make. And Jackson seems to be very supporting and okay with that decision. And I think his opinion in that regard and how he feels would need to and should even factor in more than Lorelai and Rory's opinion ever needed to. So if the 2 partners in that situation who are going to parent this child are both okay with how this child is being brought into the world, I don't think anyone else has the right to question it. They can be concerned for the safety of the person bringing this child into the world, but and that cause for concern, I think, is valid, but it's still not their choice to make.
Yeah, I agree. Again, pros and cons, risks and benefits. Everything in life is like that. And it's up to everyone to make that call for themselves, whether the people in their circles like it or not. So, what about, speaking of, well, it's a flimsy segue, but I'm going to do it anyway. Lorelai had a hospital birth. And as we mentioned at the top of the episode, Lorelai's pregnancy and having Rory comes up in one Scott class and the other one dies when she goes to career day and gets this chat. And then the Karens descend. Just like the same haircut and the same sweater. It's like, and they just rip into Lorelai for promoting teen pregnancy, which is absolutely not what she was doing. She was just trying to be honest and forthright with these girls. And well, I guess it was guys and girls loving the questions at her. But what'd you think of that scene? Both the talk itself and the flock of Karens descending.
Yeah, it was a very interesting scene. I can absolutely see how and why the teenagers in that classroom are going to question Lorelai on her teenage pregnancy, on why she chose to give birth to her child, because hopefully none of those kids would ever be put into that same predicament. But you have to assume that some of them are probably already sexually active at that point. They're wanting to, I hope, be safe in that regard. But I think they're also just, stuff like that doesn't happen often. And I think a mother of that age choosing to give birth to a child instead of aborting it, or even perhaps putting that child up to adoption, happens even more infrequently. So I think they were just, I don't want to say maybe intrigued isn't the right word, but maybe just curious about Lorelai's decision and why she chose to do that and how it impacted her. And these kids are not going to be able to have the same filter in terms of asking those questions as their parents, or the Karens in this case, should. So I think it was just real curiosity that was coming into play there. It wasn't that they were trying to perpetuate like an idea of like, oh, like, if this happens to me, it would be okay, or it's something to strive for. I think it was just blatant curiosity. And I think their parents and the Karens took it the wrong way. And they just horrendously and inappropriately blamed Lorelai for it when she didn't instigate that conversation. She was just trying to be truthful with how her life had played out and the choices that she made. And she even says, like, listen, like, it worked well for me, but this is not something that I encourage or that I would recommend for any of you. I got very, very lucky with my situation and with the child that was given, that I had and that was put into my life, but this is not how you should think that your life should or could go. So don't follow down my path. I think she was trying to put a stamp on that too, and just say like, no, like, I understand your questions, but this is not what that's about, and don't live my life or strive for it by any means. And the Karens just, again, took it in the most horrendous and egregious way and just came down on her for it really unnecessarily and really harshly. And I think Lorelai handled it to the best of her ability. But it was not okay what they did, because again, Lorelai had a choice from the moment she got pregnant of whether she wanted to have that child or not. That was always her call to make. She chose to carry Rory to term, to give birth to her, to raise her, to keep her in a part of her life as opposed to like adoption. But no matter what she would have done, it was never for anyone else to comment on in any way or to pass judgment on. So I think this definitely stands out to me in the show as one of the most blatant mom shaming moments. And it's atrocious. And nothing about it was okay with what the Karens did.
Yeah, they came up and were like, sounds like you just flaunted your mistakes. And, Lorelai was right to say, you have no right to judge me. Like, all I said was that my situation worked out okay. And like, this isn't the only time that she's asked this, but one of them says, "What kind of mother are you?" And she says, "The kind that doesn't gloss over things just because they're a little uncomfortable." And that was an excellent response for one. I gotta put that in the bank because that was great. But yeah, they come out hot judging her, and clearly they think that her getting pregnant as a teen and going through with it was a mistake. And so, there's the first instance of mom shaming. And, I don't think that's the only time she ever gets that. I think, Strobe is like, you went ahead and had that baby and ruined everyone's lives. So it's coming from all sides, really.
And Strobe, just saying.
Yeah. We dislike Strobe quite a bit. And then, next up comes that next layer. What kind of mother are you? Just for being honest with a group of teenagers who, it's clear that that sort of conservative mentality of abstinence and not being forthright with kids about this stuff is dominating the school, perhaps. And maybe that's why they're curious. And finally, they have someone who maybe they feel like they can ask about it. And it backfires badly. But yeah, obviously, I think that scene is really why I want to talk about this topic at this particular point in time. And it also does kind of feel like a bit of a natural segue from a recent conversation we had about stay-at-home moms versus working moms. And I'm sure that sort of choice will also come up in further discussions this evening. So, yeah, this was just one of those really uncomfortable scenes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, now that we're talking about Lorelai and Rory, I do want to touch briefly on Strobe and Francine and Emily and Richard's response to Lorelai choosing to have this child to raise Rory in the way that she did. How do you feel about, because in my mind, there was very clear mom shaming of Lorelai coming from both her own parents, but also from Christopher's parents. Do you think that's correct? Do you think it was ever appropriate? Do you feel that it's a parent's right to shame their own daughter in that way? Why or why not? Like, what do you make of all that?
You know what? Parents and in-laws are some of the most common groups of people who are likely to shame mothers. Like, the call is coming from inside the house most of the time when it comes to mom shaming. No, I don't think it's okay for parents or in-laws to shame mothers for the choices they make just because it's not the same way that they did things. Because, one of the things that's kind of remarkable about parenting is that, with each new generation, we get the opportunity to learn new things and to try new things and to raise our kids to be better than we were. And I think, that's a huge part of Lorelai's ethos is I want to give you everything I never had. Like, I want you to have the kind of upbringing that will allow you to flourish instead of being controlled and manipulated, because I learned from the experience that I had growing up that this is not a good way to parent, and I'm doing things differently. And so that's absolutely her decision to make. And so the fact that her parents are so judgmental about her more laissez-faire attitudes towards parenting, like they just don't have the ground to stand on, really, to be too judgmental about it, because look in the mirror first, guys. Like, look at what thou hath wrought. So but and it also goes back to the shaming of the decision in the first place, as I kind of alluded to earlier. It was her decision to make. It was her body. It was her life. Her parents were willing to support her. A lot of people don't have that option. So I don't blame her for making that choice. But I think it is telling that, a family-friendly network broadcasts a show about how teen pregnancy is somehow superior. Well, maybe that's a little hyperbolic, but you know what I mean, about like the show kind of makes teen motherhood seem
idyllic.
Easy peasy. Yeah, idyllic, easy peasy lemon squeezy. It made it seem like Lorelai's life before Stars Hollow was terrible and her life with Rory in Stars Hollow was great. And it simplifies the experience of a lot of young single mothers. And it, other than that one moment in Dear Emily and Richard, it never ever touches on the possibility that Lorelai might have taken another path. So again, it was her decision to make. Might not be the decision that everyone wants to make, but it's not cool, to put it gently, for Strobe and Francine or Richard and Emily to berate Lorelai continuously for years for that choice, because it's her life.
But like, even from Richard and Emily, the mom shaming never stopped with Lorelai giving birth to Rory. I mean, it would be great if it had, but that was never going to be Emily and Richard's style. Even once Lorelai and Rory enter back into their lives on a more permanent basis, with Rory as a teenager, they continue to shame Lorelai for her decisions and for her lack of financial stability and the choices that she is making with how she has conducted her life, where she has lived, how she has chosen to raise her daughter. And even when Rory becomes a legal adult at the age of 18, per the law, like, it just, Emily and Richard, they never stop for the rest of, I feel, Rory's life. And granted, we only see her again when she's 32 in the revival, but I feel like it's never going to even stop then. And I could even see a scenario in which they shame Rory, perhaps, as a mother, as she starts raising her own child. It wouldn't surprise me. But the point I'm trying to make is that Emily and Richard, I feel, always have judgment to pass, and they pass it freely, even when perhaps they know that they shouldn't. But that's just their that's just their personality.
Yeah. I think to the fight between Lorelai and Emily in Lorelai's kitchen after the dance. We've talked about this a few times in the past, but just a few things that Emily says in that fight are very mom-shamey. You know, she says, you know, you threw your life away, which undermines all of her decisions from 16 to now. And Lorelai rightly points out, look around. This is a life. I didn't throw my life away. My daughter's amazing. I'm happy. I have a great job. And you don't get to come in here and tell me that I threw my life away, because it's my life and I get to determine, you know, when it's thrown away and when it's not. And then, of course, once again, get that line, what kind of mother are you? And then Lorelai just throws it right back at her. What kind of mother were you? So there's sort of a reciprocal judgment there, where, you know, Lorelai does hurl a lot of insults toward her mother and makes jabs at her behaviors and decisions over the years and how she was raised. So it, you know, maybe not unwarranted either. So there's that, but it's just a very overt example of Emily coming in and very directly criticizing the job Lorelai has done with Rory, when this fear response kicks in. Oh crap, Rory's gonna follow that same trajectory that Lorelai did, and nobody wants that. So, like, where have you gone wrong, Lorelai? This must be your fault somehow. Projection.
Yeah. Do you have anything else about Emily and Richard? Because I have another person coming to the forefront that I want us to get to, who does a lot of mom shaming, whether I think they ever intended to or not. And I want to move us on to this person.
Fair enough. I'm done with Emily and Richard.
Okay.
Just done with them.
It's fair. Yeah. And I get it. Let's talk about Luke.
Yes.
Quite the mom shamer. And I don't ever think he was doing it intentionally or with intent to cause emotional harm to the women that he was shaming, but he does it nonetheless, and we need to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say let's start with the shaming that he does to his own sister Liz. Keeping it in the fam.
Yeah. And I mean, this is sort of a larger question, and we maybe don't have to answer it in full here. But where is the line when it comes to valid criticism versus mom shaming? Because it sounds like Liz had quite a few issues of her own while Jess was younger. And it sounds like maybe she was neglectful or not the best parent. And so is Luke wrong to criticize her and to maybe cast some aspersions on her parenting abilities?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is that criticism perhaps moves on from becoming mom shaming to just being rightfully concerned for the welfare of the child. And there's a difference there. And there has to be, because you're not saying like, oh, I can't believe you put your kid in that outfit. It looks stupid. It could be something as detrimental as like, did you actually remember to feed your child today? Like, did you provide them with food? Have you given them the proper necessities, clothing, food, a roof above their heads, otherwise, like, to provide them the stability and what they need in life as a child to survive and to subsist. So I think in Luke's case, mainly, I mean, we're talking about Jess, and I think there's a difference with how he interacted with Liz in regard to Jess versus how he interacted with her in regards to Dula. But I think with Jess, his concerns would have been more valid and in place and appropriate, because he's not shaming Liz for a choice that is neither here nor there in terms of how it can impact or would be detrimental to the child's upbringing. He had valid concerns with how have you impacted Jess with your negligence. And I think that's a really good, perhaps, word to bring into the conversation here, because you're not really mom shaming anymore. You're just calling out negligence with a child. And I think it's important to differentiate that when he was coming down on Liz, he was concerned in that regard. And it was different, perhaps, than how he interacted with Liz when it came to Dula, in terms of, again, the whole home birth thing, how he comments, not even with Liz, but just on women breastfeeding in the diner. It's not negligence. It's just, no, well, now you're just being a jerk and you're passing judgment. But there's the difference there. And I think that needs to be taken into account.
Very well said. I agree with that. I think there's a big difference between sort of like the minor stuff, the small potatoes of being like, oh, you bottle fed instead of breastfed, or, oh, you co-sleep. Oh, you let them have that many hours of screen time. Like there's a difference between being like, well, I wouldn't do it that way, and literally worrying about someone causing harm, doing things that are actively dangerous or neglectful, as we've said, neglectful or negligent. And it can sometimes be a fine line, but there are a lot of ways to be a good parent, and not every decision is the end of the world. Like I said, the bottle feeding versus breastfeeding. Luke calls out women breastfeeding in public in the diner, which, jerk move, Luke. Please don't do that. Please, anyone, don't do that. It's normal. It's natural. It's great. Don't be a jerk. I think a lot of women get judgment for not breastfeeding when it's like, you have no idea why someone isn't breastfeeding. There are any number of reasons, either practical or medical, biological, that a woman wouldn't be able to do that. And so ultimately, formula is just as healthy And it's not your place when you don't have the context to be like, well, you should be breastfeeding, right? So, like I said, there's a number of ways to be a good parent. And so as long as you're not doing things that are actively dangerous or harmful, just stay out of it. Mm-hmm. And with Jess, you're right. Luke had some valid concerns. But by the time Liz and TJ get together, she's stabler. She is sober, seemingly, at least from whatever harder. Like, they always allude to it. They never talk about it. It was a family-friendly show. So we don't actually know what her specific troubles were. But she seems more with it. She's older, more mature. She has a partner to support her. And Luke is a lot more supportive, being like, you know, you're in a different place and you're going to be great and I'm going to be here to support you. And so good on Luke at that point for doing that, even though he and TJ were still talking about Liz behind her back a little at the diner. Mm-hmm. But something else that sort of occurred to me on the Luke front is kind of, you know, flipping the tables a little bit. Not mom shaming, but uncle shaming a little bit from Lorelai, where it's like, Luke, you have no idea what you're doing. Why did you bring him here? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? I would have sent him home. You know, Lorelai, it's one of the few times she seems to like pass judgment on somebody else's decisions and guardianship choices other than her mother. Any thoughts on sort of, you know, parent shaming in a grander sense, or shaming dads? I know this is mom shaming, but like just a quick discussion on dads.
It's a really good thought, because it kind of falls in line with the next question that I was going to ask you anyway. So this is a good transition, and I'm still going to ask you that question anyway. We've talked about it a little bit already in one of our previous episodes about whether we thought Lorelai was warranted in her calling out Luke for Jess's behavior at that point. I think that she was in line with calling out bad behavior that she saw. Because in that regard, Jess was somebody who was going to be existing in the same town as her daughter, who her daughter was potentially going to be running into, a young man who she had invited into her home at that point. So she needs to be mindful of how that behavior could impact Rory and the code of conduct and the standard that she is trying to set for Rory in terms of what she deems as appropriate behavior. So I think there's something to be said for that. And I think that she, just from knowing Luke and this is kind of the same point that we've made already, but I'll reiterate it again, just knowing Luke as a friend at that point for X amount of years, I think she was just trying to look out for him. And just, you know, she says, like, listen, like, I've had a kid now for 16 years. This is new territory for you. You're not necessarily going to be able to recognize and pick up on the red flags and the warning signs with behavior, and in this case, teenage behavior that could lead to something really problematic or detrimental, not just for Jess, but for Luke himself. And so I don't think she was necessarily trying to pass judgment. I think she was just trying to say, like, hey, there are some really big red flags here with Jess's behavior that you need to be aware of. And because I care for you as a friend, I'm trying to open your eyes to some of what that is so you can try and, you know, counteract that now before this turns into a situation that neither you nor Jess want to have. So I think she was right in terms of raising those concerns. I can understand Luke's response in just saying, you know, it's not your place to necessarily tell me how to parent, but I don't think that Lorelai was, and I don't think that she was shaming necessarily. I think she was just trying to say, you need to be aware of XYZ right now, because this could turn into something really bad if you don't address it. And I think there's a differentiation that needs to be made there too, with how not just moms, not just dads, parents and guardians, and how they interact with other parents and guardians sometimes that advice can be helpful because it's so hard, I think, to want to accept the fact that whether it's your child, in this case, your nephew, you don't want to sometimes accept the fact that they are behaving badly and that their character needs a course correction. No one wants to have to recognize that or hear it. Just think like, if you had a kid, like, would you want to come to terms with the fact that, like, your kid's behaving badly and they're on a wrong path right now? Like, what parent wants to have to hear it? Because I can see how it can come across as a criticism when it's not. And I think that's how Luke took it, as a criticism when it should have been received as advice. So I don't think that she was shaming. I think she was just trying to look out. But there's a gray area with how a parent can perceive shaming versus advice and care and concern.
I completely agree. And it's an excellent point that bears conversation, because you're right. I don't think Lorelai was intentionally trying to shame him into changing his behavior or trying to manipulate the situation in any way. But I don't know that anyone is ever really trying to do that, or at least they're not admitting to themselves that that's what they're doing. But, it can often be unsolicited advice based on something you did or something you didn't do but wish you did. And so maybe you don't even have the firsthand experience about the thing you didn't do. You just know that it's different or not what you did. And so do you really have a leg to stand on to even be saying these things to another parent? And whether you intend to cause shame or not, it can still happen. I don't know if Luke was feeling shame. I don't know if he was feeling that sort of like painful sense of unworthiness and failure. But unsolicited advice can still have that effect on people where it can make them defensive, because you're right. Nobody likes to hear that what they're doing is wrong, because presumably there was a reason they made that decision in the first place. And there's something about their situation, their context, their gut instincts in that moment about what they're doing. And sometimes you have to honor that in yourself and in other people. Everybody's got a particular philosophy and set of like a fact pattern that they're working with that you may not know about. Lorelai does know Luke pretty well, and she's only just met Jess, but she kind of tries to insert herself into this situation. Like, I know more than you do, and I'm telling you not specifically what to do, but I'm telling you that you don't know what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of, again, overstepping and maybe not the best way to approach it. I think in general, people are trying to be helpful. They're trying to provide some tidbit of helpful information to someone else. They're not usually doing it to be a jerk, to get someone to do things the way they want them to. Sometimes they are, Emily, I'm looking at you, and Mrs. Kim. But in most situations, both on the show and in life, it really is just genuine concern. Like you said, like Lorelai might have had reason to be concerned and to bring up those concerns to Luke, but I think she went about it in the wrong way in her approach, in saying, you're unprepared for this and I know more than you do. It's sort of that know-it-all attitude is what bruised Luke's ego. And that's how we got Nick and Norris and Nancy. So it's a whole thing. It's nice to accept information and wisdom and advice gracefully, even if you're not going to put it into practice. You can continue on with your own path without, causing some sort of conflict over being like, yeah, I'm just not going to listen to you. And I think maybe parents should sometimes be less defensive. Learn something. consider something else. Look for disconfirming information. Be critical about what you've heard, and don't take it always as a criticism of what you've done, because not every parent is going to make flawless decisions all the time. Parenting is really just sort of a million little decisions, and nobody is going to make a million perfect choices. So, don't feel bad if you didn't get it right the first try, and don't be scared to try something new just because you've never heard of it before. Think it through a little bit, accept information from others who actually know what they're talking about, not just like randos on the internet, but like people who actually know what they're talking about, and listen to people who have your best interests at heart. They're probably not coming for you. They just want to be helpful. And so defensiveness doesn't really help the situation. And that's the place that Luke went to immediately with Lorelai. And it's understandable, but he might have been more receptive, and she might have been gentler in her approach as well. So like there's problems on both sides with that one.
Yeah. Wow. Just I applaud you for an excellent and well-rounded and just well thought out thought process there. That's just, I don't disagree with any of it. I'm just, yeah, that was a perfect and just well thought out opinion. So I applaud you for it. And I agree with all of it. I want to pose you a follow-up question that kind of goes in line with it. We see Lorelai giving advice to Luke that I think we can both agree stems from a place of just cause for concern with Jess, cause for concern with Luke, and how Jess's behavior could be detrimental to him. And I'm steering us a little bit away from necessarily show examples, although if you want to bring them into this conversation, if you think that there are any that apply, please do. But I feel like in this day and age, and maybe it's something that happens most prevalently on social media, there's mom shaming for the sake of mom shaming. And I want to pose this question to you. Why do moms do it to one another? Why are women doing it to one another? When it stems from not wanting to throw concern out the window, throw care out the window, throw compassion out the window. And for all of the instances that we see moms shaming other moms just for the sake of doing it and for the vitriol that's behind it, why do you think moms and we as women are doing it to one another? Just like, that's my question. Why?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I think I actually have something of an answer. I think there's a lot of reasons. One of them is the desire to validate what we've done. So to validate our own decisions, and saying, well, hey, this is what I did and it worked. It makes you look like a good parent. And you may also have some genuine belief that your experience can help someone else. And so you might be putting it out there as like, I just want to help you. I want to provide you with an option that was successful for me. That's a nice sentiment. But when you're doing it in such a way where it's like, well, you're clearly an idiot and I did this the right way, that's ego protection right there. So that's one element of it. And I think there is, on top of that, a larger societal shift when it comes to how we view parenting on like a moral level in terms of safety and supervision, and just how we view the world in terms of like how dangerous it is. Perhaps movies and media and video games and sort of scare tactics, and the don't get in the stranger danger, don't get in the van with the guy who offers you candy kind of vibes on television for kids, comes out of this place of deep societal anxiety. And we want to protect our kids. And I think maybe sometimes we go too far in and trying to protect them in terms of like passing laws where kids can't do things independently. Like kids can't go down the street to the park by themselves without adult supervision under a particular age. And then it becomes a legal question, you know? I heard a story about, I think she was like, she worked in the district attorney's office. She was an attorney, a high level attorney, government attorney. And she left her 2 kids in the car while she just popped into Starbucks to grab a coffee, like real quick. They were in sight. She knew her rights. She knew her responsibilities. She knew the law. And a cop saw that there were 2 kids unsupervised in a car and came up and started questioning them and started sort of like scaring them. And then she came out and was like, "What are you doing?" I was right there. They were in eye line. And it started this whole process of like, there was a formal complaint lodged against her. Child Protective Services came and investigated her. And it was this whole thing when she didn't do anything illegal. She barely did anything troubling, you know, like she was probably 20 feet away. And, you know, Starbucks these days, it's like all glass windows. Not to mention there are probably security cameras and there are people everywhere. And so it's like, you know, there's sort of almost that like public safety, if you will. Like you're out in broad daylight, you're locked in the car. And so just this sort of like moralistic idea of, well, you're a neglectful parent because you stepped away for 3 minutes to do something for yourself or run an errand that you needed to do. It just speaks to a, well, I would never do that with my child kind of mentality. And in a way I can see it. I am someone who is filled with deep anxieties about a lot of things. And if I ever have a kid, I will probably be like, where are they? Are they okay? Are they safe? Are you alive? But also I can see that, you know, not every parent is going to be quite so freaked out by the idea of their kids playing independently or their kids just sitting for 3 minutes somewhere. You know, there's a threshold that's crossed with negligence, right? So yeah, I think it is sort of this societal shift where we've determined that protecting children is like legally more important than one, allowing parents to make a call about what the appropriate boundaries for their own kids are, and 2, what might be good for the kids in terms of learning to do things by themselves, learning to pay attention to their surroundings, being able to interact with the outside world without their parents' interference every minute of every day.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I wonder, but I think to an extent, like, especially when it's on social media, I wonder how much the whole concept of like the 5 seconds of fame is coming into it, where mothers can shame other mothers or even call out other mothers or just highlight how they think they're being an extraordinary mom to get views or get clicks or just get notoriety because it self-fulfills their ego. But that's horrendous because you're spotlighting your child and potentially causing them, I don't know, maybe some sort of damage, whether you know it or not. And there's so much there that I feel like is just at the center of the mom or that person wanting an ego boost, notoriety. Maybe they garner satisfaction from tearing other people down, which is even more like that. Just that would keep me up at night. Like, why people feel the need to do that to other people. You may not agree with how someone else is parenting their child, but as long as that child is not in immediate or direct or significant harm that is going to be an emotional or mental or physical detriment to that child's life, what gives you the right? There's, you know, religion, and those choices that can come into it, in terms of just, again, just religion, diet. There's just so many different things. But again, what gives a parent, and in this case, for the sake of this conversation, a mom, the right to shame another mom if the child is happy and healthy and fed and prospering? And if all of those things apply, and any person or any mother is still choosing to tear down another mother, again, in the, for what I said, just for whether it's for notoriety or an ego boost, which I feel like it, in this day and age with social media at the forefront and a lot of moms videotaping their children and then putting those interactions on social media, why are you doing it? And I feel like a lot of the time it's for all of those reasons that I just illustrated. Notoriety and ego boost. And it's just like, you're doing it for you. You're not doing it for your kid, and you're potentially hurting them or shaming another mom and tearing down another human being. None of it is okay. And it just leads me back to the question I originally posed, where it's just like, why are we doing it? And I can't think of a good reason off the top of my head why it's happening. I mean, I'm sure there are instances of moms putting their kids on social media or highlighting other mothers who are doing a good job, but I feel like they're so few and far between, and most of it is just, again, for reasons that are just for self-gain, or for just, I don't know, just not great things. I'm not wording this well, but just for there's more negativity to why moms are doing that at this point than positive things. And I think that social media has really perpetuated that notion of just throwing moms in front of a bus because for whatever reason it makes you feel better or it makes you look better. And I hate that we do it to one another.
Yeah. There's a lot of pressure on moms to keep tiny dependents alive. And, and there's sort of this almost culture of purity around parenting where you have to do everything perfectly and you have to make it look like you're perfect and you've got the perfect family and all of your decisions are perfect. It doesn't exist. Anyone who looks like the perfect mom on Instagram is faking it. There's just absolutely no way that they've made, that they're batting 1,000. Okay. So we need to get over that idea right off the bat. And so I think that pressure can get to people where they want to seem perfect themselves, even though we all know that it's a fallacy. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there is sort of a bit of a self-promotional aspect where the easiest way to make yourself look good is to put someone else down. But then sometimes that also makes you look bad because we can see that you're being a dick about it. So yeah, I think a lot of it is pressure. And, they probably got judgment from other places and are displacing it onto others. It's this horrendous cycle of just constantly looking at other people instead of focusing on what's best for you and your family and blocking out sort of the extraneous noise of people who don't know your situation and don't know you and don't know your kids. Because like I said, there are a lot of ways to be a good parent. There are a lot of right decisions. I think there's a limited number of things that are categorically bad that should always be avoided. That would be reasons maybe for some righteous shame, like neglecting your child's nutrition, neglecting their medical needs. This might be a hot take. Neglecting to get them vaccinated, using pseudoscientific medical practices like homeopathy on them instead of taking them to an actual pediatrician. Stuff like that might be cause for real concern. But for the most part, a lot of these things just don't impact you. And so the fact that you feel the need to go on social media and like yell at people with impunity, like to be a keyboard warrior for what? You know, you probably don't even know these people. And some of the things that people are shamed for are truly just like the dumbest. Like I think I said something about Beyonce being shamed because Blue Ivy's hair is kind of wild. And I'm like, what kid doesn't have wild hair? Like, it's impossible to like keep kids' hair coiffed perfectly all the time. What are we doing as a society?
What's up next? We're gonna just constantly shame for like jam hands? Come on.
Okay, you know what? I might give you some shame for jam hands because there's no good excuse to be sticky. Sorry, it's like a personal thing. I really hate being sticky. Anyway, that's
tell
fine.
that to like a 5-year-old child who you give like some peanut butter and jelly and you're just like make a sandwich. Like jam hands are gonna happen.
Jam hands. Yeah. Yeah. It's a tough situation.
Yeah.
But we should just stop with the vitriol online because there's absolutely no need for it. Like you don't know these people, just shut up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to steer us back to the show a little bit now, because the psychology behind parenting and why parents tear one another down. We could be here talking for another 6 hours about it.
And we probably will touch on it in the future.
And yeah, we will get back to this because we have so many more episodes down the pipeline touching on parenting and motherhood and fatherhood and a lot of these things that we haven't even talked about yet will come back up. But centering this back to the show, I want to ask you this. Yes. Which of any of our females on the show would you say was the most guilty of mom shaming?
Okay, here's what I will say about this show. As a show that centers motherhood so prominently, it is very sympathetic to mothers. And so there aren't as many instances of direct mom shaming, or at least maybe in the ways that we see it these days with the nitpicky criticisms or the unsolicited advice. We don't get a lot of that in this show. We actually see a lot of support or attempts at support for other parents. They may not always be successful, but it's not like what we're living through now. And so I would like to give Lorelai some credit. Part of the reason I chose my I Smell Snow mug is a shout out to Lorelai because she is great at providing empathy and support to other parents, especially other mothers, except maybe her own for reasons of her own trauma. But she's always there to offer a kind word or assistance or bridging gaps. You know, she was really there for Mrs. Kim and Lane, which leads me into my answer to your question, which is Mrs. Kim, I think.
Mm.
I mean, other than one-off characters like the Karens, I was revisiting Will You Be My Lorelai Gilmore recently.
Mm-hmm.
And I had almost forgotten about the mom shaming in it. You know, Lane is still pregnant. She hasn't even given birth yet. And Mrs. Kim is already sticking her nose into Lane's kids' lives. You know, she wants weekly Bible studies. She wants no unclean meats. She wants, you know, all kinds of stuff. And Lane's attitudes to parenting are much like Lorelai's, a reaction to her own upbringing. She wants her kids to be able to listen to whatever music they want. She doesn't care or want them to go to church. She doesn't care what they eat. She's not going to be that strict mother that she had. And Lorelai, once again, steps in to literally mediate a negotiation between them about how Lane's kids will be raised. Because Mrs. Kim doesn't want her grandchildren to be raised as heathens. That's literally the word she uses, is heathens. And so it's a much more direct example of mom shaming than we see in a lot of the rest of the show. So I think she's my answer because she's very set in her ways as, you know, a sort of like a fundamentalist Christian, basically. And so her ability to let Lane make her own decisions as a mother is negligible, shall we say. She has so many particular ideas, and Lorelai comes in and is very empathetic. She's like, you know what? I know this is a sensitive topic, and you have to be reasonable. And Mrs. Kim expresses to Lorelai how it almost seems like she's jealous that like Rory doesn't reject everything that Lorelai stands for in the same way that Lane seems to reject Mrs. Kim's beliefs. And so it comes from a genuine place of, this is what I believe fundamentally about life and the world and the universe and your spirit and the spirits and souls of your of your children, my grandchildren. But Lorelai really helps them put their differences aside and find the common ground of motherhood and how different decisions can still lead to good outcomes for different kids. And Mrs. Kim needs to let Lane make some of those decisions, and they need to respect each other's beliefs. And drawing lines and being too rigid about these things isn't going to help anyone. And so it's a nice scene. I quite enjoy their interactions in that episode on that front. Do you have any other examples that come to mind or differences of opinions about who's the worst in the show?
I mean, Mrs. Kim had her opinions, and she shamed, to an extent, yes, other mothers for not raising their children as she would deem appropriate. And I think that's where, again, whether it's Mrs. Kim or Lorelai or Suki, whomever it is, I think that's what it boils down to, and that's what needs to be noted, is that every mother is going to have a different opinion on what is best for their child. Again, as long as that child is not facing immediate or direct harm physically, mentally, emotionally, in any other sort of context, mothers have a right to mother as they see fit. We can disagree with how Mrs. Kim was raising Lane. But I don't think there was ever anything she did that was detrimental to Lane in a way where, like, this is just extreme, but detrimental in a way where it's like, you know, should we be calling Child Protective Services about this? My answer for Mrs. Kim would be like, no, because she had her very stringent and strict religious beliefs, and she wanted Lane to live her life in a certain way and had certain expectations. But she wasn't withholding anything from Lane that would allow her to not survive. And I think, again, not just with Mrs. Kim, but just with any mother, I think that's where you need to start looking and questioning things in terms of, does this mother deserve to be shamed or called out? And if the child's health and well-being is in severe question or in question at all, then the answer is yes, we probably not even need to shame or pass judgment. We just need to interfere for the sake of the child. But thankfully, nothing is coming to mind for me within the context of this show I don't think we ever saw any instances where the well-being of a child was in grave danger.
I think I may have misunderstood your question. I thought you were asking about like which mom on the show shames other moms the most.
Well, that's also a good question too, and I can understand why Mrs. Kim would be your answer in that regard. Because again, she had her own personal stringent beliefs that she made her own for Lane. But you can't expect, yeah, I can understand why. Like, she could never expect or think that her beliefs for Lane were going to be Lorelai's beliefs for Rory or Suki's beliefs for her kids. Every mother's going to do it different. And that's where we've talked about it before. I think it was a really great moment that Lorelai had going to Mrs. Kim and just being like, listen, you're doing a great job. Maybe just loosen up the purse strings for Lane a little bit and just allow her to breathe and allow her to live. She wasn't shaming and she wasn't criticizing or passing judgment. She was just trying to make Lane's life, I think, a little bit more freeing and enjoyable, and just giving one-to-one mom advice in a non-critical way.
I totally agree. I love the empathy with which she approaches that situation. I think it was delicately and deftly handled. So that's one of the main reasons I bring it up basically every episode, because it's just so lovely. But that brings me to a question on that topic. Lorelai talks about the mom code. We've had a few discussions about the mom code as well. And I think this goes maybe a little bit to mom shaming as well. But there seem to be some times where Lorelai ignores what Mrs. Kim wants for Lane. You know, Mrs. Kim has her beliefs about what diet is appropriate for Lane and what activities. And Lorelai facilitates a lot of those things for Lane behind Mrs. Kim's back. So she'll
so does Rory,
go to Mrs.
though.
Kim. Exactly. Like she's not the only one. But obviously Rory and Lorelai are colluding a little bit on that. But you know, she tells us that she has to respect Mrs. Kim's parenting decisions, but then goes behind her back and gives Lane pizza and candy bars and a space for her rock band to practice, you know, and she gives her a place to live when Mrs. Kim and Lane are not seeing eye to eye. And so is she being hypocritical? Is she doing the right thing? You know, where is the line between the minor, like, oh, it does, like, this doesn't matter, versus like the fundamental decisions that a parent should get to make for their child? And on that note, this child is 16 and is intelligent enough and autonomous enough to make some of these decisions for herself. So what's the deal?
That is an excellent question. You're right. I mean, as much as it's not even that I don't want to admit it. But again, Mrs. Kim was wanting Lane to live a certain way and maintain a certain diet. It's again, I feel like there might be some discourse on this within anyone watching this. I think it is well within Mrs. Kim's right to want that for her child. And I say to want that for her child, but not necessarily expect the execution of that desire. Because should Lane herself say, I know you want me to potentially have a vegetarian or a vegan or a more wholesome diet that excludes these particular foods for my physical well-being, that's fine. Should Lane herself decide that is not what I want for me, and in this case, have Lane say, I want to partake in the devil's starchy fingers, and I want to partake in candy bars and pizza and soda, beer, whatever it may be. If that is Lane's choice to partake in those things, it's well within her right to do so. However, for Lorelai and Rory, but especially Lorelai, to say, well, I know that your mother doesn't want you to be eating these foods, but I am going to freely provide them to you anyway, because I know that I'm just going to freely provide it to you because that's what I feel is right. That's not Lorelai's call to make. And I think that's where you need to sort of have, like, it's black and white in that way, where if it's Lane's choice to divert from what her mother has deemed appropriate for her in terms of diet, that's fine. But I think that Lorelai needs to be respectful of what Mrs. Kim wants for her daughter in terms of that. Because again, it's not like Mrs. Kim is saying, I want my daughter to never eat and to starve herself, and I'm just going to feed her once or twice a week, and don't you dare give her food otherwise. That would be a problem. She's not saying that. She's just saying, I would prefer that my daughter only eat these certain foods because I feel like it's more healthy for her. Again, there's the difference there. And I think that difference also, and the result of it, needs to come down to, if Lane chooses to not abide by that of her own cognizance, that's one thing. But for Lorelai to go actively against what Mrs. Kim wishes for her in that regard, when she's not actively, again, causing Lane physical harm, I think that Lorelai, yes, should have been more respectful of the dietary wishes that Mrs. Kim was trying to put into place. And by extension, Rory, perhaps. But they didn't. And they just, you want fries? Have some fries. You want a candy bar? Have some candy bar.
Yeah. Smuggle in a Snickers. It's really interesting. And we'll talk about this more in a few weeks when we talk about food and diet culture on the show. Mm-hmm. But Mrs. Kim has some seriously moralistic ideas about food and what's clean and unclean and what that means for your eternal soul. Basically, there's this weird extrapolation of, like, your diet and the purity of your body and all of that factoring into her having flaxseed muffin month and never allowing anything fried in unclean oils. All of these sort of very strict nutritional guidelines for their household that most people think are ridiculous. And so, that's where I came to this, where I was like, does Lorelai have to be respectful of something that is so extreme when it, moralizing about food can be very dangerous and very detrimental to people. And it can give them really messed up relationships to food for a long time. It can cause disordered eating and orthorexia and all these things. So,
that's a really good point.
Like, and like you said, you made a great point about Lane being able to make these choices for herself now. And so is Lorelai simply disrespecting Mrs. Kim, or is she facilitating Lane's autonomy about what she puts in her own body? And it's a very, like, delicate question, but it sort of speaks to the point of, regardless of the situation, Lorelai's behavior says something about how she feels about Mrs. Kim's decisions. And even if it's not a direct criticism to Mrs. Kim, it's a statement about her beliefs that essentially Mrs. Kim's whole diet thing is crazy.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like this indirect shaming and disrespect of Mrs. Kim's decisions on a lot of fronts.
I agree. Again, excellent thought. I would follow it up with more counterpoints, but what you just said is true. We are going to have a food and diet episode coming up within the next couple weeks. So I want to save a lot of those thoughts for that and not extrapolate on them now. Is there anything else within the context of the show and or real life instances of mom shaming that you want to highlight before we start winding us down and closing this one out?
I feel like we've touched on a lot of the big stuff, although once again, I had a huge thing of notes for this. And I feel at first I was like, oh my God, are we going to have enough to talk about on this? And here we are, an hour and 20 minutes in.
Us, of course, we're always going to.
Of course, there's more than I thought. And I think there's more than other people thought on this topic. It's a really interesting one. And I'm sure that there are a lot more things we could say about it. And, they might come up in other parenting episodes down the line. But I had sort of a more speculative thought that I thought could be kind of fun to end off on, because it's sort of future stuff that doesn't happen in the show. So we've touched on the fact that now social media has allowed us to basically put everything out there and to share our stories about parenting and about our choices, and putting it on blast like that for everyone to consume is, generative of judgment, because you're going to have all these opinions coming in from all different angles. It's no longer just your inner circle giving you their 2 cents. It's everyone on the internet can theoretically see this and weigh in. So I have kind of 2 semi-related thoughts on this. One is Rory's book. Just the idea that she's going to put all of Lorelai's parenting choices on blast now in print and put it out into the world for consumption. And, Lorelai says to her in the cemetery, I don't want anyone to know that, like, I left you at the hardware store in a bucket when you were 2. And, Rory is kind of fighting her on this. And so, it's Lorelai being maybe rightly defensive about maybe some of her choices when she was younger, or some perceived failings in herself on that front. And my second thought, please just give us a second revival, because I need to see this. But Rory is going to be parenting at a much different age than Lorelai was. We got the show in the early aughts. There were a lot of really great moms on TV. There are a lot of legendary mothers depicted on television. And Lorelai consistently makes lists of most beloved TV moms. But, it was a different time where she wasn't subject to social media criticism and all that kind of stuff. She probably would have got a lot of flack if she was 16 now and was going through this and was documenting it on Instagram. Which brings me to Rory being a parent in the late teens and 2020s. I wonder how we would view her parenting decisions now through our more modern lens, and how the audience would react and people in Rory's world would react to her parenting decisions. Do you have any takes on sort of how our more recent understandings about the effects of certain types of parenting and putting everything out there online, how the uptick in people going to therapy and dealing with their own traumas might impact our perception of any future iterations of Gilmore Girls? Because I think collectively as a society, we've done a lot of work in this area in the last couple of years, expanding our vocabularies, learning about new things, and unpacking our own childhoods. And I'm seeing a lot of discourse on the mothers in the show, in on YouTube video essays and in their comment sections. There are a lot of people just picking apart everything that Emily and Lorelai do. And so how do you think that would translate to Rory in 2024 if we got a revival next year? Wink, wink.
Yeah, I mean, first off, as always, please, dear God, Amy and Dan, give it to us. How many times do we have to come on this podcast episode and beg? Just let us have it. But I will say, in my mind, it's initially hard to answer that question because we won't know across the board until we see how Rory parents. Emily, and again, we've talked about this before. Emily was, I think, raised and bred, for lack of a better way of putting it, but it even causes me pain to put it that way, to be a trophy wife and a supportive and stand by your man and just be the emblematic trophy wife spouse of Richard. I think she tried to pass that on to an extent to Lorelai, and that might have been their hopes for her. Lorelai's life obviously deviated with Rory, and certainly that was never going to be Lorelai's path for Rory. But it's hard to say how things would be different until we see how Rory actually parents. It could go so many ways. Like, she could fall into, especially, and I wouldn't love it, but it wouldn't surprise me if she parents similarly in a way to how Emily parented Lorelai, considering the years that she spent reacclimating herself into their way of life and coming to appreciate it, and strive for it. And I think her interactions with Logan and the Huntsbergers also could be detrimental in a way too, because she fell into a sort of privileged category that she didn't have growing up, but she experienced privilege as a late teen and as a young woman in her early 20s. And I think that could potentially factor into how she parents her daughter going forward and the privilege that she affords her daughter in her life. I would hope that she's not making the same mistakes that Emily did with Lorelai, but it wouldn't surprise me if I still see some of those mistakes being made. So, to roundabout answer your question, I don't know, because I won't know until we get it, if we ever do and we see it. But it wouldn't surprise me to see Rory falling into a trap of being more like Emily than Rory, or being more like Emily than Lorelai, and to falling into some of those bad patterns and those bad habits, and to potentially having certain expectations for how her daughter should be raised, for then shaming other moms, and maybe almost embodying Emily more than her own mother, despite what Lorelai did for her for years and years and years. If that makes any sense.
It does. You're right. It's hard to know for sure because we would need the actual parenting decisions to critique. But one, that actually kind of brings me to one of my points that sort of meta is we can talk all day about the parenting decisions made in the show. And it goes to show that, like, we're sometimes shaming these moms. Like, there's a bigger conversation happening about it now. And I think it's good in a lot of ways to maybe use TV and cinema as a way to unpack these harmful choices, to see them play out on screen and to analyze them, to learn from them, and to try to avoid them ourselves. But it also gets into some sticky territory where sometimes people in the real world are making very similar decisions. And, you know, a decision that can be bad in one instance can be totally fine in another. And I think sometimes we have to recognize that when we nitpick people on TV, we might be creating an atmosphere for real people that feels like an attack as well. And so I'm hoping that, you know, people, like, if we ever have a conversation about individual parenting decisions, that people don't feel that we're judging them, because their situations are probably totally different. We're reacting only to the context of the show, and only in the sense that we have seen this play out and we know what happens, right? Whereas, you know, in the real world, we're all just out here doing our best with imperfect information, and we're trying to do the best for our kids. And it's not always easy to know what is best, and we'll just drive ourselves nuts trying to be perfect when that's not a realistic expectation. So I just find it interesting just how many video essays and how many comments are out there about this, that, and the other thing, where we're being very judgy and very shamey ourselves because we feel safe because they're not real people. But real people do this and make these decisions every day. So there's that aspect of things. And yeah, we need more information about how she's going to do it. But I would love to see Roy parent and see if she does fall into some of the traps of the sort of beliefs of the upper crust about what's acceptable and what's not, and all of that. And just see if she, like, one of the interesting things about parenting, I think, is that each generation is an opportunity to be better than the one before, to take what we've learned about humanity and psychology and human flourishing and apply it to our decisions about our own lives and about those of the people around us and who we impact, who we pass these things on to. And so I would really love to see a version of Mom Rory where she takes the best of Lorelai, where she just wants nothing but the best for her kid, but she also takes some of, you know, the best practice out in the real world. Maybe she reads some parenting books. Like, Lorelai didn't read any books on parenting. She read Deanie. You know, when Sherry asks her that question, she just winged it. And I want Rory to learn from Lorelai's lack of experience. I don't know if there's anything specifically that I want her to take from Emily, because I have seen that a lot of Emily's ideas are very outdated and very harmful in a lot of ways. And she is often a quite manipulative person who has some troubling ideas about how people should behave. Mm-hmm. So I maybe there was something, I'm sure she's not entirely terrible, but there's just a lot of things where I see negative impact from her attitudes and beliefs, like, you know, run around the block, you're going to fit into the next dress no matter what. And just the control and the clothing and the food and the behaviors, the debutante balls, the cotillions, it's all just very, it's too prescriptive. And I don't love that. So I want Rory to take the best of Lorelai, but to learn and iterate and do something better so that her daughter isn't maybe like left so much to her own devices, and maybe has like a little more structure so that she's not always kind of being parentified, being the mature one in the situation. I don't want Rory to backslide. I want her to learn and grow and be better.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. But I would hope that should be the goal for any of us as mothers or as parents, is just to always want the best for your child. Mm-hmm. Whether it's taking the advice of other mothers or parents who are entering your life, trying to give you what they deem as sound advice, whether it's something that you can figure out or learn for yourself. But at the forefront, I think it's a good goal to always just want what's best for your child, and to always try and give them what is best for them, whether it's what you deem is best, or even, again, factoring in the advice of what another mother or parent deems is best. Because it's cliche, but sometimes, yeah, it can take a village, and it is good to take stock of other people's opinions and beliefs, because they can be valid and positive towards what your child might need. But again, at the forefront, put your child first, put their needs first, put their livelihood and their well-being first and foremost. And mom shaming aside, because it's just atrocious. Do what's good for your kid. And I think you ending on that point is just a perfect, and I think a good capstone for us to close this one off on. Because
Actually,
okay, you have one more. Okay, go.
I have one more. Actually, I have a bunch more, but I'm not going to go into.
But yeah, we've been going for a while now, and we will get back to a lot of these things. So
this is true. I'm just going to throw a quick shout out to Paris for one. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about this more later. I would like to evaluate like her and her motherhood, and maybe sort of following in her own mother's footsteps and going, like, you know, being raised largely by nanny and then having a nanny for her own kids. And she also runs a surrogacy business, which opens up questions of like mom, you know? Me, we a nanny, we have all these like pseudo maternal figures that we didn't even get a chance to touch on. And the show also doesn't have a lot in the way of surrogates or adoption. But, you know, just to throw it out there, sometimes people are judgmental of how women choose to conceive or become parents, how they choose to bring children into the world, whether it's, you know, vaginal birth, C-section, natural birth. Why am I blanking on the word for this? Epidurals, you know, like there's all these sort of like other kinds of medical judgments that people make. So just want to pay some lip service to that real quick. And then my last point is mom guilt. It feels like a subset of mom shaming, where it's not external, it's internal. It's the messaging we're sending to ourselves about our worthiness as a parent and about our perceived failures, our like imposter syndrome sometimes with parenting. And we see this in the show as well. We have Suki with, well, this one's almost a little bit of mom guilt, but also a little bit of wife guilt, where she hides out in the room at the Dragonfly to watch Dark Shadows and eat Toblerones. You know, she feels bad for taking some time for herself when self-care is extremely important for moms, because you can't pour from an empty cup. And she's tired, and she just wants a little bit of alone time. And, you know, as long as she and Jackson are sort of equally splitting their parenting responsibilities and their alone time, she shouldn't have anything to feel guilty about. But another instance that is very prominent is in Let Me Hear Your Balalaikas ringing out, when Lorelai is sitting in Rory's room and Paul Anka is sick, and, you know, the talk obviously turns from Paul Anka and her belief that she should have noticed the signs that he was sick, that, you know, he was trying to tell her to put her shoes on, that she shouldn't have socialized him at Kirk's doggy daycare. And it turns to, how could I have let this happen? How could I not have done something sooner? How did I not see this coming? And she says she's a bad mother, and Luke reassures her that she's not. And I think Luke is absolutely right in that moment, that Lorelai has to let Rory make these mistakes and work these things out on her own sometimes. And I think there's a bit of a recency bias thinking that Logan might be the problem, when a lot of this probably goes back a little bit further, and there probably wasn't anything she could do, because she wasn't far enough away from the situation to see it with any objectivity. And so she doesn't need to beat herself up for that, especially because Rory is now 20 and making her own decisions, and it's a complicated situation. But Lorelai doesn't need to berate herself for it necessarily. Do you have any hot takes on that before we close this out?
Not necessarily any hot takes. I kind of agree with everything that you just said. I feel like going back to Paris, we didn't really see enough of her as a mom, or how she raised her children to pass any sort of judgment. Again, nor should we, unless she was causing severe detriment to her kids, through her action or inaction. But no, I wouldn't say any further hot takes. I just I agree with everything that you said. And it just goes back to something that we've illustrated plenty of times already throughout this episode. There's no right way or perfect way to parent. No mother, no father, no couple raising a child is ever going to know the 100% correct way or have it down pat on like what is good and what is right. And this is the standard by which everyone should parent or raise a child. We're always all going to do things differently. And I think at the end of the day, if we can be here for one another, as aunts, as uncles, as mothers, as fathers, as in-laws, as friends, in any capacity, to help raise a child in the best way that we all seem fit and deem collectively good and healthy for the child, I think that's good and that's right, because it's always going to, again, take a village, and there's always going to be outside support and advice that is needed and that is given and that is wanted. So if we can be there for one another in that regards, in terms of let's not shame one another, let's just raise this young person in the best way that we possibly can, that should and always be the goal.
Well said. Perfect way to leave off.
Yep. Oh, and we thought that this was going to be a quick one, but we ended up having a lot of thoughts, and we still didn't get to everything.
I know. Just tune in for future installments.
For more. We have so many more thoughts on parenting, and we're going to have a whole episode on fatherhood one of these days, so we'll get back to a lot of this. Keep joining us for all of that. In the meantime, what is coming up next for us?
Next week, we're going to be talking about another interesting one. Gender dynamics and gender stereotyping and portrayals on the show. I have seen a lot of, gender essentialist stuff that we need to dissect and look at. We're going to be talking about Take the Deviled Eggs, which is where Sherry has her baby shower and she picks green, even though it's a girl and it's not the typical thing. And, so they're playing into the stereotype of, isn't like pink a girl and blue a boy, and what's green, an alien? So just the whole idea of caring so much about gender and gender reveals and all kinds of ideas about what's appropriate for men and for women, because the show plays into it a lot.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's going to be a good conversation. And we'll probably go along on that one too, but come join us anyway, because we'll have a lot of good and just hopefully well-rounded and intelligent thoughts that you will appreciate.
Here's hoping.
Here's hoping. But I'm confident in us. In the meantime, again, every week that goes by gets us closer to FanFest. If you're watching this and you don't know what FanFest is, it is a literal Gilmore Girls weekend in the best way that we can put it. It will be in Algonquin, Maine this fall. Several members of the cast will be there. We will be there. Come join us. Come hang out with other Gilmore Girls lovers, cast members, behind the scenes people from the show. If you haven't already bought a ticket to it, what are you doing? Because if you love this show like we do, Kate can attest you need to be there.
Oh, yeah. Not only have I bought my ticket, I bought a lobster sweater.
Yeah.
I'm so excited for Maine.
We're excited. We hope that you'll join us. Again, if you love Gilmore Girls, this is the convention for you to attend. So just Google it, FanFest. Yeah. Yes, because Emily Corona will be there. So just Google it, FanFest. It'll pop up for you. Go buy a ticket. You will not regret it. We promise. While we wait for that, and while you wait for next week's episode, go back and watch some of our old content. If you want more GG stuff in the meantime. And please remember to always do all of those YouTube things for us. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel. It's one click and it really helps us out. And the support is always so appreciated and grateful, and something that we're grateful for. And share our videos if you're feeling even more generous than just the one click. Again, all of the support is just something that we really do truly appreciate. In the meantime, we hope you enjoyed this conversation. Come back and join us next week for the conversation on gender dynamics. and enjoy your weekend in the meantime. Go watch the GG episodes, because it's always just a good thing to do. And we will see you next Friday for dinner.
Cheers.
Ciao.